Good morning, everyone. Happy Friday, and thank you for joining us for today's stakeholder call to discuss the draft tariff language for the Transmission Service and Market Scheduling Priorities Phase 2 initiative. My name is Isabella Nicosia, representing ISO Stakeholder Affairs, and I'll be facilitating the web conference today. I'm also joined on the line by Anthony Ivankovich, our Deputy General Counsel from our regulatory team here at the ISO, and he will be taking us through the draft tariff language today. Before we get started, the draft tariff language is available out on the initiative webpage. You can get to that page by going to kaiso.com. Then you'll click the Stay Informed tab, click Policy Initiatives. That'll take you to our main initiative landing page. And then in the search bar, if you type in Transmission Service, it should pop up in that list below. And then on that page, the draft tariff language is posted under that first activity on that page. Today's call is being recorded. The recording is for informational and convenience purposes only, so any related transcription should not be reprinted without the ISO's permission. And then if you need technical assistance during the meeting at any point today, you can send a chat to the event producer. Our event producer today is Michelle. And we will be pausing for questions and comments throughout the call today, so if you connected to audio through the WebEx using that Call Me feature, you'll need to select the raise hand icon, which is located at the bottom of your screen, and that'll place you in the question queue. If you connected to audio outside of the WebEx and are just joining us by phone today, then you'll need to press #2, and that will enter you into the queue as well. And then just a reminder to please remember to state your name and affiliation before making your comment or asking your question so that we know who is speaking today. And then you can also send your comment or question via the chat to myself. Again, my name is Isabella Nicosia, or you can send it to all panelists, and we'll make sure to read that out to the group or direct it to the appropriate person. So the agenda for today, I'm going to hand it over to Anthony here in just a second, and he'll kick us off with the walkthrough of the draft tariff language, and then we'll leave some time at the end to go over next steps. So here is just a slide of where we are currently at in the stakeholder process. The initiative was approved by the Board of Governors on February 1st, 2023, and now we are in the process of developing the draft tariff. So I am going to go ahead and pull up the draft tariff language, and I will hand it over to Anthony to kick things off.
All right, thanks a lot, Isabella. First thing I'd like to, thank everybody for participating today. I know when I do these tariff walkthroughs, it's really beneficial to get feedback and edits, and really over the years have found it to be extremely helpful to us in putting together, good tariff language. This is the first draft of the tariff language coming out of this phase of the initiative. So I'm sure there's, a lot of things to talk about, a lot of edits that we'll be able to make, and a lot of ways that we'll be able to, hone the tariff language over the next few sessions so it's, much clearer and robust tariff language. My plan today is to, walk through each of the sections at a high level. I'm not going to sit here and just, I think, read this word for word, but try and walk through, explain each section, and then after each section or related sections, we will stop and take questions. I probably plan to stop fairly often to take questions so we're not getting ahead of ourselves, and we're all keeping up. I'm also, a little under the weather today, so there may be times here I'm slowing down and needing to catch a breath, and we'll have to do that. But we shouldn't have any problem getting through this in the 3 hours, I don't think. So again, I really appreciate everybody's participation and look forward to your input here. The first, today we're focusing on the ATC-related tariff provisions. As was indicated in the market notice, the long-term wheeling priority provisions, we're still in the process of working and developing those. We will include them when we get to the next round of tariff, along with the edits that arise out of this session and everybody's comments. The edits really come into two sections, Section 23 of the tariff, and then Appendix L, which is ATC. Under 23 is basically the transmission capacity section of the tariff. Not a lengthy existing section, but basically just says what transmission the ISO has. As folks are probably aware, most of the transmission on the ISO is basically daily new firm use. We're not changing any of that with this initiative. We're just finding a way to accord priorities to wheeling through transactions. As we talked about in the initiative, the interim measures that we currently have in place end effective June 1, 2024. So as you see on section 23.2 here, the plan is that these tariff provisions that we're proposing here would go into effect June 1, 2024 at the end of the interim provision. So before I start going into any more substance, I will stop and ask if anybody's got any questions.
Michelle, do we have any questions on the phone only line?
No questions on the line.
Okay.
Okay, let's start then digging into the substantive provisions. We'll start with 23.2.1, which are the general requirements for monthly and daily wheeling through priority requests. And again, these were pretty much, most of these pretty much discussed through the various papers that were issued. Basically, under our process, a scheduling coordinator will be able to request a wheeling through priority for, a month or a day. In the monthly time frame, it will be up to 12 months before the month before which it seeks a priority. And in the daily process, up to 7 days before which it seeks a priority. To be eligible, the scheduling coordinator, has got to submit a priority wheeling through request and attest to the following things. One, that an executed firm power supply contract to serve external load supports the priority wheeling through. That contract can also be contingent on the availability of getting the wheel through, or it can be based on an ownership of a resource to serve external load. The scheduling coordinator also will need to provide the megawatt quantity of the contract, start and end dates of the contract, points of entry and exit to the ISO grid. The scheduling coordinator will need to indicate whether it's willing to accept a pro rata allocation or partial award that comes out of any request window to the extent there's insufficient ATC to accommodate the entire request, and meet any other eligibility requirements for a monthly or daily wheeling through. As we talked about in the process, the ISO is not going to award a monthly or daily priority for a period greater than the hours of the underlying firm power supply contract. So if your underlying contract is a 6x4, you're not going to be able to be, 6x4 for peak hours. You're not going to be getting a priority wheeling through at 3 in the morning. So it's, again, an important fundamental underpinning of our proposal is, the wheeling throughs have got to be supported, by the underlying firm contract. You'll note I give some examples in the tariff. It's typically, not the ISOs. We typically don't put examples into the tariff language. I think to clear up any confusion, you will find in this section and in some of the other ones, we are, giving some explanatory type examples to show how it works, to make sure these things are clear and we don't have confusion based on somebody just looking at the tariff language. There will be a minimum duration for any power supply contract that can support a monthly or daily wheeling through. and those are specified in the monthly and daily sections respectively. Any wheeling through that gets a priority will be considered a priority wheeling through. That's currently defined in the tariff. We will have to change the definition, but once you get the priority, you're considered a priority wheeling through. Consistent with the approach today, all other wheeling throughs without a priority are basically non-priority wheeling throughs. Priority wheeling throughs, consistent with today, will have a priority equal to ISO demand as set forth in sections 31 and 34, which are basically the tables setting forth the scheduling priorities. So I'm going to stop now and see if we have any questions.
So again, you can ask a question by selecting the raise hand icon, which is located at the bottom of your screen.
There are currently no questions in queue.
Okay. I will go on to next section, 23.2.2 and 23.2.3. So we'll take those together, and then I'll stop for questions. So the nature of a wheeling through priority. A wheeling through priority does not convey a physical transmission right, and it's not a physical reservation of transmission service. That occurs through our market systems, and most transmission, again, is daily new firm use. A wheeling through priority only accords a priority when the scheduling coordinator actually schedules a wheeling through transaction on a given day. If the scheduling coordinator does not actually schedule a wheeling through, the priority is inapplicable. Again, this is our transmission service is daily transmission service. I think we say it elsewhere, but I think it bears mentioning here. If you don't schedule in the day ahead, you're not losing your priority. You've got up through real time to be using your priority. That's mentioned somewhere in here, but just not in this section. 23.2.3, termination or modification of a firm power supply agreement underlying a priority wheeling through. So basically, if a firm power supply contract supporting the wheel through is terminated for any reason, or it's modified such that the quantity or import or export points changes, the scheduling coordinator, needs to notify the ISO immediately. If the termination, of the contract occurs before the priority has gone into effect, the priority will basically terminate. The ATC will, go back on the shelf to be available for others. If the quantity of the supporting firm power supply contract is reduced, the megawatt quantity of the wheeling through priority is going to be reduced correspondingly unless the scheduling coordinator can show that it has a replacement contract for the same megawatt quantity and basically the same import and export points. If a supply contract supporting the wheel through is terminated after the priority has gone into effect, the scheduling coordinator, retains the priority and is going to continue to be charged for it. However, it will have the ability to resell its wheeling through priority. So I'm going to stop there and take any questions on those sections.
All right, looks like we have some hands. Let's go ahead and unmute Greg.
Jeannie, thanks for your time. Just a question on the section 23.2.3, where it suggests to have the wheeling through priority must notify the CAISO immediately. And just a thought on what that means exactly, immediately, and possibly having some definition of that may be helpful, and kind of what the repercussions are around not meeting that timeline. Just because it seems like that could influence the other processes as to whether that reservation is retained or made available again to the market, and when other parties would be able to have access to it.
Nope, I think that's a good point. Both good points.
Great. Yeah, because I think it also then has the impact on the resale market, and then kind of what's that gap that is allowable to have the underlying supply contract go away and then have the resale occur.
Okay. Do we have any other questions?
We do. Let's unmute Doug.
For the Bay Area Municipal Transmission Group, the sentence that refers to the priority is terminated after the priority has gone into effect. When does the priority go into effect? When it's granted?
For whatever period has won it. So if you've won a monthly priority for March, it goes into effect March 1. So any contract that would terminate, or March 1 or after would fit into that category.
So it's not 13 months ahead when it's granted. It's
no, it's
the
that when the
delivery
priority actually in effect.
Okay. Yeah, I think that should be clarified. And I just wanted to point out that, parties could effectively get granted the priority and then have 13 months to back out, right, by modifying their contract, which seems like it's only sort of a partial commitment. CAISO's, they're getting an option on the priority for a year. I don't think was what was intended.
This is Milos, if I can jump in, Milos from the California ISO. Yeah, I mean, this is one of the areas that we noted we would monitor, that there would have to be a kind of a determination or an explanation as to what's changed in the contract. And that's one of the areas that I think ourselves we would monitor, and I think we would expect the market monitor as well to keep an eye on these, that entities are not gaming the process of having a contract, getting the ATC, and then backing out on it, depending on the terms of that. But yeah, that's something that we're going to keep an eye on. And to the extent that things change, then that entity would be needing to explain and describe the need for that change, that they no longer have that contract or that reservation prior to the starting date.
Thanks, Milos.
Yeah.
All right, we have another question from Scott.
Hey, Milos, this is Scott Renzel with PG. Why can't we do it if the contract changes in any way, shape, or form, you have to reapply for the priority? You're granted it if it comes in under the coverage that you're talking about, but you have to reapply for the priority if you change contract in any way.
Yeah, maybe note that in your comments. I think it's what would need to change in that contract. I think
that's fine, but that's still a definable term that says if any of these terms in the contract change, blah blah blah, you have to reapply to obtain the priority. If somebody's corporate address changes, I don't care, right? That's not what I'm talking about.
Yeah, and maybe that's a fair point. And I think somewhere later in here, and correct me if I'm wrong, Anthony, I think we'd make some distinctions in terms of if there are certain substantive changes prior to the service starting versus later. But I think that's a fair point, Scott, and maybe you guys can note in the comments defining further some of those terms. I think we can certainly think of a few as ourselves as well. But yeah, let's consider that in this next iteration and submit that in your comments.
Yeah, I'd rather have a proactive point to the change
Yeah.
than a reactive point to the change, as much as I trust your
Yeah,
opinion.
and maybe we can list, some of the examples of terms that are changing that would trigger, this section.
Yep. Thank you.
Yeah.
Michelle, do we have any other questions?
There are no additional questions in queue.
Okay.
I think Scott raised his hand again. Oh, he just lowered it, so I don't see any other questions in queue.
Okay, let's move on to 23.2.4, and that's the section on applicability to ISO LSEs. So this states that, ISO LSEs can compete to obtain ATC in the daily request window, which is 23.5. A scheduling coordinator, we would have a similar attestation to what's required for wheeling through customers, that the ATC request is supported by a firm power supply contract, a contingent contract, or an ownership right. They'd also have to attest to the megawatt quantity of the power supply contract, the points of import and into the ISO grid, start and end dates of the power supply contract, the specific hours of the contract, and whether the scheduling coordinator is willing to accept any pro rata or partial award of ATC if there is insufficient ATC to accommodate the entire request. So I will stop there. I think the next ones coming up are more related to each other. So I'll stop and take any questions on this one.
All right, let's unmute Doug.
Thanks, Doug Boccignone for BAMX. It seems like there's another way that this is applicable to California LSEs in the monthly process that isn't mentioned in the body of the tariff language, but it's in Appendix L, where the monthly RA showings are considered as part of the allocation, the ATC determination process. It seems like it might, this jumps from the 13-month ahead to the daily. There's also this month ahead process.
I think the focus here was really on the request window. I mean, we could make that wording a little clearer here, but that's really the focus here. The monthly process isn't a request window type process. It's just, you can make, RA and non-RA showings, and if there's capacity available, you may get it. But this is really intended more to focus on the request window.
But that monthly process is part of the request window once you're in.
No, it's separate. It's not a part of the request window. Only in the daily, only the daily part for California LSCs.
Yeah, and if it helps, Doug, and I think we'll get to this a bit later if I understand your question. Whatever's been set aside for native load in that monthly process is considered an existing commitment as you go down, similar to somebody having reserved wheeling through priority ATC in the monthly process. It's considered an existing commitment as you get down into calculating daily ATC as well. So you're looking to protect for that already. So the daily ATC would expect it to be lower than what it is in the monthly horizon. And I think that will get reflected as we get into some other later sections. But I thought that's what you were asking, and the idea is that yes, you're protecting for your existing commitments, you're carrying that through into the daily horizon. Now from that 13-month horizon, you're carrying that all the way through into the daily.
Right, and I think that the part that's missing is And don't get me wrong, I think you captured it in the appendix, but is when you're doing the 13-month, you're considering, the historical RA for the native load needs and the TRM, but then every month you're updating it. And, so when you're kind of at the prompt month, you are considering updated information. And it just seems like it wasn't very clear in the tariff part. And then it like jumps to this, like daily process, which is a separate process. I recognize that.
Okay. Yeah, maybe Doug, if you can, suggest that in your comments and maybe how you would suggest we clean that up. I'll note that here in our notes and we'll circle back internally and see how we can make that connection clearer and cleaner.
Okay. Thanks.
Okay, I'm going to take the next.
We have another question.
Okay, thanks. Go ahead.
Oh, go ahead.
From SCE. A two-part question, or two questions rather, and very basic questions. First one, how is this process going to impact MIC allocation? And once we have a MIC allocation, like an LSC, I think most of the time we're not procuring in a year ahead time frame, right? We are waiting till month ahead time frame and see how it comes out and procure imports based on our import allocation rights. So how does this process going to impact MIC allocation and the priority of MIC if not used in year ahead time frame? It seems like we are looking at 13-month horizon to assign ATC.
Yeah.
Well, for starters, this is a completely separate process than MIC.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and then this is Milos. Let me just add. I mean, we're now in the tariff drafting stage, and so none of these sections here are changes to the MIC section. But ultimately, you would still need an allocation of MIC to demonstrate a resource for RA purposes at a particular interface. And then once you have that, you've shown that on your RA plan as you usually do. We'll get into later sections, kind of some true ups that we do once the actual RA showings come in. But the basic premise is, and I don't know how much engaged you've been in this initiative, but the basic premise is that at 13 months out, we're making some assumptions about what are the going to be the imports under contract. And you get closer in time, you true up to the actual RA showings as well as non-RA contracted imports that may be shown. And those RA showings are supported by the MIC that's been allocated or that you've acquired otherwise. And then once you get closer to those daily horizons and the actual schedules, the MIC becomes irrelevant at that point in terms of you already used some of that MIC to show your monthly RA showings, and you continue to schedule much as you do today those RA imports that you've used in your plan. But this section does not propose any changes to the MIC allocation and the MIC overall process. There may be in the future here, as the RA program is evolving, as we're looking at other things, there may be additional initiatives that are looking at MIC enhancements to look at how is MIC utilized, but this particular tariff change and this initiative is not changing the MIC process at this time.
Got it. At least what I'm hearing is MIC still has a priority, and we can use firm imports with IARs until month ahead time frame without any, without worrying about ATC allocation.
That's right. You're continuing. That's right. You're going to continue then. If you have MIC, you can show those RA imports in your monthly or annual RA plans.
Got it. Mm-hmm. And then my second question goes into daily window. Again, MIC is relevant at that point, like you said, but usually, California LSCs procure, need be at least IOUs, imports, daily imports, for liability events in summer months, especially like September, right? So what does this mean? because it's kind of hard to plan 13 months out, right? How much daily imports you're going to procure on those heat wave days. So little confused how this is going to work out, and concerned too. Do we need to plan ahead and try to procure ATC to compete with wheel throughs for those heat wave days?
Yeah, this is Milos again, and I think we'll get into this. We talked about this throughout the initiative, but we'll get into this as well in some later sections in the tariff here that Anthony's going to walk us through. But ultimately, once you get beyond the RA horizon, the monthly horizon, and now you're into the daily time frames, closer in time to real time, a week out, a day out or so, there is some TRM, or transmission reliability margin, that we'll get into later, that's been set aside for certain conditions, uncertainty in both the monthly and the daily time frames, that has been set aside for additional imports to continue to serve load reliably. We've also allowed, and this will be, I think, in a later section, where LSEs can submit, if they've contracted for additional imports in a shorter granularity time frame, that they can vie for ATC to give those effectively a priority, or to be considered if we get into certain corner case conditions where the priorities apply. But I think between accessing ATC in the daily horizon, if that's contracted, plus the TRM that may have been set aside on an interface for different types of uncertainty, I think that allows for protections for additional imports that may have been contracted in those more stressed conditions where we rely on those imports to serve load, and ensuring that those are protected once we get into the post-half process, where we're applying the equal priority between wheel throughs and load. And we'll get into all of these. So give us a little bit of time. We'll get into those sections, and we'll illustrate both how you can access ATC in the daily horizon for additional contracted imports beyond the monthly RA showing, and then the TRM and the different uncertainties that we would look to set aside transmission for to support additional imports if those uncertainties materialize.
Got it. Thank you.
Additional questions in queue?
All right, if there's nothing, I'm going to move on to 23.3, and we'll take a couple of subsections, and then stop for questions. First, 23.3.1, which pertains to historical contract information about non-RA import supply. So basically, we will set up a process where each LSE can attest to the ISO and support information regarding its firm non-RA contracts that were in place to serve load basically during the 2 years prior to the month for which the ISO is determining ATC. As you remember, we're looking at, historical showings to determine the ATC set aside. Under the draft tariff language, the import supply contracts that can be reported under this section have to be monthly contracts or a portfolio of shorter term contracts for the month. We would require LSEs to attest and provide the start and end dates of the contracts, the megawatt quantity, and the ISO scheduling point where the energy was delivered. I'm going to do 23.3.2 as well, and then we can stop for questions on these two sections. And this basically pertains to a new contract information. So under the process we're proposing, before we establish ATC for a month, 13 months out, we would have a process that would allow ISO LSEs to show the ISO any new contracts for imports to serve their load that are not reflected in the historical data that the ISO is considering for that month. The LSE would have to attest whether the new contract is basically a replacement for other capacity that was another contract that was in place during that time, or is incremental to such capacity. The LSE would again have to provide the start and end dates of the import contract, the specific hours, the megawatt quantity, and the point of import. If the new contract is intended to be a replacement of capacity, the LSE would have to indicate that what contract is being replaced, the term of that contract, the megawatt quantity, the points of import. And again, the ISO is going to be using this information to determine, the existing transmission commitment component of the ATC calculation. If the LSE intends the new contract to be incremental capacity, i.e., it's additive to capacity under contract during the historical period, the LSE is going to have to attest to that and make a demonstration that the capacity will in fact be incremental. This is probably an area we could use some help on from folks in terms of, putting in requirements. As it stands now, we've indicated that an LSE can make that demonstration by showing resource plans, expected load growth, incremental procurement ordered or approved by a local regulatory authority, or other relevant information that demonstrates the additive nature of the contract. And I think I will stop there and take any questions.
That's good, Greg.
This is Greg Ribka from PG. Just a question on the proposal and making sure that it's being reflected here. The proposal is that these new contracts would only be coming out of or reducing the ATC during the 13 months ahead period, not in the rolling basis. So not 7 months out, not 3 months out. There's only the one time to execute those contracts and have them come out of the ATC. Because that's how it's reading, but I just want to make sure that that's the intent of it.
Yeah, that's the intent. I think that's what was reflected in the proposal. I'll defer to Milos, but I think that's what the proposal was.
That's right. That's right. And yeah, and I think hopefully that comes across here. Yeah, the intent was that 13-month out, and then again, once we get into some of the other components, we're reflecting in the native load needs through those historical calculations across that 13-month horizon, accounting as well for some TRM for uncertainty that once we get to that TRM section for uncertainty that there may be some differences between those historicals and future showings. So such that we thought it was appropriate for that 13-month out only to be able to account for those new contracts, since we're going to be accounting for some uncertainty already within the TRM that there may be some deviations from historicals based on information that we see. But yeah, that was the intent, Greg.
No additional questions.
Looks like we have a raised. Yeah, there we go.
Hi, Doug Bochignone for BAMX. Isn't it though, it's the 13-month out and then again 1 month out, right? There is this opportunity to make these incremental showings, and I mean, if you're not allowed to displace previous commitments for the wheel throughs, but if you can make up into the TRM, for example.
Yeah, and I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, Anthony, but I think we'll get to that at the two-up.
I think it's captured in the language. I think.
Yeah, and that process will be the next section we'll discuss, 23.3.3, monthly non-RA showings.
Okay, great. Yeah, I just didn't want to give the wrong impression that there was only one opportunity. There's really one 13-month out and then each month. I had a comment about the demonstration of incremental procurement. Wouldn't it also, if you were displacing an internal resource, would you consider that also to count? So you're using an import to replace an internal RA resource?
This is Milos. Yeah, I think that would make sense as well. That you know, one of your incremental needs that's driving you to go to imports is that something else has changed such that you're relying more on imports than you were in the past. That's what we're trying to capture, is that demonstrating that increased reliance on imports than in the past. I think that's a reasonable factor to include, and maybe you can add that in your comment, and we can look to reflect it here.
Okay, great, thanks.
All right, no additional questions.
Okay, I will move on to 23.33 as which I just mentioned, which is really the the monthly opportunity to show non-RA contracts. So basically, under this process, before the end of the RA cure period, an LSE can show any non-firm RA contract that it has for the month that it desires to be considered for purposes of determining an existing transmission commitment component. The LSE, similar to the other requirements for, wheeling and the day-ahead request window, got to show an executed power supply contract, ownership or a contingent contract, the megawatt quantity of the contract, the import point, start and end dates of the contract, similar to the other requirements we've talked about. So let me stop there. I know that was an issue that got a lot of discussion during the stakeholder process. So let me stop there and take any more questions before we go on.
Do we have any questions, Michelle?
There are currently no questions in queue.
Okay.
Looks like Doug just raised his hand.
Yeah.
Doug Roshan, would this also include incremental RA contract showings?
I would assume the RA, I think the RA is already accounted for in whatever folks put into their RA showings.
Okay, so those are just accepted. Those just count
some folks
on their
show
face.
RA above their RA amount. It's usually not, I don't think, cut off. So I think any RA showings go through that process.
Okay, yeah, that's what I was assuming, but I guess it's just not mentioned here. So this is incremental to that.
Yeah, this is anything that's not going to be an RA.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, I'm going to go on to, go ahead.
No, there are no other questions in queue.
Okay, I'm going to go on to 23.34. And basically this is the opportunity for, if the ISO designates import capacity under CPM, there's possibility that it can get ATC. So if the ISO designates, does do a CPM import, we will first utilize the TRM to the extent any TRM capacity is available. However, if the CPM designation is for an annual or monthly RA deficiency, we will utilize ATC to the extent any ATC is available. And if no ATC is available, then we will utilize the TRM. If there's insufficient TRM and the CPM designation is for something other than an annual or monthly RA deficiency, such CPM designation would be eligible to be assigned ATC only to the extent there is ATC available at the time of the designation. I'm going to do one more section because then we get to, I think, a cleaner cutoff break. We also, in 23.5, we made a commitment in the stakeholder process that we would hold sort of an annual summer ATC and TRM assessment meeting with stakeholders each year. 23.3.5 is basically, putting that obligation into the tariff for us to hold that meeting. So I am going to stop and take questions before we start getting into the request window discussion.
Let's go to Alan.
Alan, your line's unmuted. Go ahead.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah, go ahead.
Hear me? Hello? Okay. Hi, Alan Meck, SDG&E. 23.3.4 was. Can I try doing just a verbal flow chart and let's see if you agree? As I understand it, I think what you're trying to say is if the CAISO designates CPM for an annual or monthly RA deficiency, then you will utilize ATC if available and then TRM. And if CAISO designates CPM for a not annual or monthly RA deficiency, then CAISO will utilize TRM first and then ATC if available. Is that what you're trying to say here?
I think that's correct.
Okay. I might recommend rewording it to something along those lines because this section was difficult. Start with your if statement and what kind of CPM CAISO is procuring, and then dictate what you're going to do. I think is a good guideline for this section.
Okay, no, that's good.
All right, Bonnie.
Bonnie, your line is unmuted. Please go ahead. Bonnie, be sure to unmute your phone or device. All right, can't hear Bonnie. We will move on to, let me try and unmute again. Bonnie, are you able to unmute yourself? Bonnie, I have unmuted you. You may go ahead.
Hello?
Yes, Bonnie, you're unmuted. Go ahead.
Oh, okay, good. I was toggling back and forth trying to figure out whether I was double muted or not. Sort of following up on what Alan said, I'm sorry, this is Bonnie Blair, Six Cities Group. In that first line, Anthony, it says the CAISO will first utilize the CPM import capacity under the TRM. That kind of suggests that there's a separate component of the TRM that's designated for CPMs. I assume that's not intended. That wasn't, yeah. In other words,
right there. I think that's a little unwieldy there.
Yeah, because it kind of suggests that there's something in the TRM that's sort of earmarked for CPM, and I didn't think that was meant to be the case.
No, that's a good point.
Okay, that's it for this section. Thanks.
All right, Greg.
Greg from PG&E. This is a comment just on the annual summer, the meeting. During that meeting, like this language suggests it'd be focusing on the upcoming summer, which makes sense. But given that there's a 13-month reservation window like if that meeting is happening in the spring looking forward, it seems like there should be a discussion and focus on TRM issues and ATC issues for the following year as well. So I think that's just something to potentially add here, that there'd be a focus on the upcoming summer and the following summer in that meeting.
Okay, that's we will talk about. That's a good point.
Right, Steve?
So,
You can go ahead, your line.
okay, can you hear me? Can you hear me now?
Yes,
okay. I have the same comment, just thinking that with the 13-month period, you know, if we look at this in April, people are already able to procure for the month of May, the subsequent summer. And as we go through that summer, it's, you know, when you get to July, they can already buy through essentially August of the next summer. So I think it would be very important to consider both summers when you're looking at that, especially considering the section further on when you explain what happens when there's RA comes in that exceeds the, where the RA and the ATC exceed the TTC on a line.
Yeah, this is Milos. I think that's a great point. We can clarify the language here. Yes, the intent was really to primarily focus on the summer for which we're about to calculate ATC. But I think we also do want to focus a little bit on just the numbers that are coming out for the, you know, the summer that's just starting a month or two away. Yeah. But we will have calculated ATC numbers for that. So let us clean up the language a little bit. We can capture both summer discussions, particularly the one where we're about to start calculating ATC. That's a bit further out.
You may, I mean, one of the things that I can think might happen when you get to that, since you've already sold ATC based on your historical look at RA, and you will have seen the annual showings for entities. So, you know, you can identify whether you're already seeing any overselling of it, one of the lines or something. Not completely, because those annual showings are, people only have to show 90%. So they may not be using as much RA as they want, you know, as they eventually will, but you know, you can at least identify if you're seeing problems already at that point.
Yeah, that sounds good. We can certainly clarify this language. We can focus on both and what kind of upcoming for the near term summer, what kind of conditions are we expecting and what impact may that have on ATC, and then particularly then the summer where we're just about to start calculating those numbers. What are the inputs that we're looking at, including there that will yield, and what kind of numbers are we expecting based on the assumptions that we're looking at that point. So we can,
for the near summer, you also have a good idea of what ATC is sold for some of those months.
Yeah, and outages that may be coming up that may impact things. So yeah, very fair point, and we can capture, you know, kind of consideration both in the near term summer and then the further out summer where we're about to calculate ATC.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
I do not see any additional questions in queue.
Okay, then I'm going to move on to 23.4, which is basically the request window for a monthly priority. I'm going to go through this, and then I will stop for questions at the end because, you know, again, this is a very key area of the proposal. So what we are contemplating is that we will open a monthly wheeling through priority request window no sooner than 12 months in advance and no later than 1 month prior to the effective date of the priority. The ISO will hold the request window open for 14 days. Closure of the request window each month will coincide with the closure of the monthly RA cure period. I think similar to what we do for, settlement purposes, we would have an annual calendar that would show the opening and closing of the monthly request windows for the entire year. At a minimum, any wheeling through priority requests for a monthly priority has got to be a 6x4 contract for each full week during the month, plus the relevant days of any partial week during the month. The ISO will make its determination regarding awards no later than 3 business days after the request window closes. The ISO will also treat all requests for a monthly wheeling priority submitted during the request window as having been submitted simultaneously at any point in time. We will treat all requests for a monthly priority in the request window as confidential during the request window period, and we will treat them in accordance with Section 20 of the ISO tariff thereafter. The ISO will award ATC to support priority wheeling through requests based on the total number of hours of the requested priority over the 13-month horizon, which again, got to be supported by a firm power supply contract. So at the, basically the principle is that supported priority requests for more hours during the 13-month period will be awarded ATC before requests for fewer hours. Again, we typically do not include examples in the tariff, but I think to make this, crystal clear, we've provided a couple of examples that we would probably keep. At least I hope they're crystal clear. But, the plan would be to include a couple of examples to show how this works. If there was a tie amongst requests and there's insufficient remaining ATC to accommodate all of them, we're going to allocate the priorities on a pro rata megawatt basis or grant part of the ATC request, but only to those SCs that indicated up front that they would accept a pro rata allocation or partial award. Any priority award for wheeling through coming out of a monthly request window is unconditional, and it can't be unwound by any awards in subsequent windows. So once you come out of a window with the ATC, it is yours, and you're not going to lose it. And I think here's the sentence I mentioned earlier. Scheduling coordinator for a priority wheeling through does not lose its awarded scheduling priority if it does not schedule in the day-ahead market. So that's a lot to think through, so I'm going to stop here and take any questions or comments. Again, this is, I think, a really important section for, effectuating how we access priority wheeling through priorities. So let's open it up to questions.
All right, I do not see any raised hands at this point.
Oh, looks like we just got one from Greg.
Just raised his hand. Greg, I'm going to unmute you. All right, Greg, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. This is Greg again. Just a question on the term a priority request versus a reservation. So it says that a priority request must be supported by 6x4 contracts. If there's a resale, does that resale also need to be held by that structure and that product, or can it be broken up? So just, is there a distinction between a request and a reservation, or are those synonymous?
I hope I haven't used the term reservation in here.
Greg, maybe you can note what we're trying to read through this here. Did you see that term somewhere in here?
Yeah, I was hoping we didn't use that word in here anywhere. I mean,
sorry, I'm getting double muted. No, it's using the term request, but then when in the later sections it's talking about resales, so it just made me think, can a resale be a sliced portion of that request, or does it need to maintain the entire length of it? Does that make sense?
Maybe repeat that one more time. I don't know, Anthony. Maybe you can repeat that, Greg, one more time.
Well, just thinking of a situation where the request could be for a 6x4. That request is given and it's reserved. That then gets resold to two different parties, each for a 6x2. Like, is that allowed?
Yeah, I don't think so. Maybe we can come back to that when we get to resales, but I don't think you could split it up. At least we haven't pondered that kind of granular split up. And maybe we can walk through an example at the resales that, you know, splitting kind of the megawatts to different contractual terms. Maybe let's hold that until we get to resales, and I'll think about that a little bit more and until we get there. But
sounds good.
I don't think we were not envisioning through the tariff language kind of supporting that kind of granular further split up into different contractual terms.
Yeah, let's discuss that more. That will be coming up shortly after the daily discussion. So yeah, I think that merits some more discussion.
All right, Steve.
Yeah, I just this is just a clarification, I guess. I want to make sure I understand where you say a scheduling coordinator does not lose his awarded scheduling priority if it doesn't schedule in the day ahead market, but they still have to pay for it, right?
That's right.
Okay. I just wanted to make sure. Thank you.
I don't see any additional questions in queue.
Okay, then let me go to the daily request window. And again, another important, component of this whole process. So I'll go through it and then we'll stop and take questions on it. Pretty much the daily process, follows the same process as the monthly request window process. Basically, we'll open a request window each day where an SC can request a daily priority, either for a wheeling through self-schedule or ATC to support an ISO LSE schedule. It can be done 7 days in advance and no later than 1 day prior to the effective date of the priority. The ISO will hold the request window open for 5 hours, and it will be during the hours we need, something we need to dig into the details, but we will specify those hours in the BPM. At a minimum, a wheeling through priority request in the day ahead horizon has to be supported by a firm power supply contract of at least 4 hours for each day during the 7-day horizon for which the scheduling coordinator seeks a priority. The ISO will make its determination on priority daily awards no later than 2 hours after the request window closes. As with the monthly priority window, all requests coming into the window will be treated as if they were submitted simultaneously. They will be held confidential during the request window process and treated in accordance with Section 20 thereafter. we will, as we did in the monthly, we will award ATC based on the total number of hours of the requested priority over the entire 7-day period. So the more hours you request, the sort of higher up the scale you are. Here we also try and give a couple of examples in the daily context. Similarly, if there is a tie amongst requests and insufficient ATC, the awards will be prorated to those SCs that indicated they were willing to accept a pro rata award. We also include the sentence that we had in monthly. If you don't schedule in the day ahead, you're not losing your priority. So again, it pretty much follows, you know, what we did in the monthly context, only on a more granular daily basis. So I will stop and take any questions about the daily window.
Let's go to Bonnie.
Hi. A question about this. So at the beginning, you make a reference to wheeling through a daily wheeling through priority, and then also ATC to support an import contract into the CAISO by a CAISO LSE. Do all of the detail rules in the section, the remainder of the section, excuse me, apply to the what I'm going to suggest you call incremental import priority request?
Yes, they do. You mean like the contract requirement and
exactly? Yeah.
And that's I think an earlier section. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. I'll suggest some edits to, you know, kind of make that clear throughout, because you know, there's only the reference to the, again, what I would propose to call incremental import priority in that first sentence, and then the rest of the time it just talks about wheeling. So
yeah, no, that's great.
Okay, thanks.
All right, Tyler.
And Anthony, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Hi, this is Tyler Moore with APS. I had a question around, well, it starts with the firm power supply contract of at least 4 hours for each day during the 7-day horizon. I guess that reads to me that you have to have a contract for each of the 7 days, but then the examples kind of conflict with that, where it says a contract for 1 day will be out prioritized by a contract for multiple days. So I guess if you have to have a contract for 7 days.
It can be 1 day. It can be 1 day. Let us take a look at the wording.
Okay.
It can be 1 day.
That's what I thought. So it'd be more like a weekly reservation if it has to be a 7-day contract. So I thought the intent was to have a 1-day contract. So yeah, it's just that at a minimum in that sentence that was making me question that. So thank you.
All right. I do not see any additional questions in queue.
Okay. All right, let's go on to, well, actually, before we go into resales, I think I indicated for those of you who may have joined late, the long-term wheeling priority tariff language, you know, we're working on that. And when we come out with the revised draft of this, we will add the long-term wheeling to it. So we've got everything, got all the tariff language going forward. So the next round we will be discussing both topics. All right, let's move on. We had a little discussion on this earlier, and this is the sale or assignment of a wheeling through priority. So we will, you know, provide procedures that allow for the resale of a long-term priority or a monthly priority. At this point in time, we are not doing any resales of a daily priority. And this may answer the question that came up earlier. A market participant with a long-term or monthly wheeling through priority may sell all or a portion of its priority, megawatt and or term, to another market participant. The market participant that sells its wheeling through priority, we're going to, again, give these, names. If you are reselling your priority, you're going to have to notify the ISO by a specific deadline, and we will put that deadline in the BPM. And again, we'll stakeholder those types of discussions. An entity cannot sell a priority or a megawatt amount for more megawatts or a longer term that it has. The compensation between the reseller and the assignee is basically going to be set at a rate established between them. The assignee who takes over the wheeling through priority is basically going to be subject to all applicable terms and conditions of the ISO tariff, including the requirement that they have a scheduling coordinator. The scheduling coordinator for the assignee is going to have the same priority as the reseller at the same scheduling points of import and export out of the ISO BAA. The ISO is going to continue charging the wheeling through priority reseller at basically at the applicable wheeling through rate. That reseller is going to remain responsible for complying with all requirements of this section. Also, to make it clear here, any resales of a wheeling through priority are only allowing the transfer of a wheeling through priority, and they're not conveying any other rights. And the assignee is not responsible to the ISO for paying the wheeling through priority reseller's financial obligation to the ISO. At the end of the day, the reseller is ultimately responsible. The assignee will be responsible for paying the wheeling through reseller, but that will be through the processes outside of the ISO, tariff. Another point we make here, a wheeling through priority reseller will not sell a wheeling through priority to enable avoidance of the firm power supply contract requirement under 23.2.1. Again, if we don't want, the firm supply contract is an important requirement, and we don't want folks basically trying to avoid that requirement through resales. I will be clear, though, we are not requiring the assignee to actually have a contract in place, but we will be there will be monitoring to make sure folks are not end running these processes. I think last 23.7.2, all wheeling through priority sales basically are posted on the ISO's OASIS and have to be there on the day before the day the priority commences. Wheeling through resellers can use the ISO's OASIS to post available priorities for resale. So I'm gonna stop there as I'm losing my voice a little. So let's take some questions.
Go to Bonnie.
Hi, Bonnie Blair, Six Cities. So you said you were going to monitor to try to prevent people from doing end runs around the contract requirement. It's hard for me to see how you could detect that kind of conduct and enforce the requirement. Why not require an assignee to show a contract?
Yeah, thanks, Bonnie. And then, Anthony, feel free to jump in. I think as we were looking into some of the rules associated with wheel-throughs, that we thought that it was going to be difficult to impose requirements on the reseller, the buyer of the resale of the transmission of the priority, and that would be difficult to impose and justify at FERC. But I don't know, Anthony, if you wanted to add anything onto that. So that's what we were going to monitor for, potential inappropriate use. And the way that we were thinking about monitoring it is first of all some random checks and reaching out to entities to if they've been subject to a resale, to evaluate the different terms and conditions, but also the entity would, in order to be eligible for the resale, I think the entity would need to demonstrate that something has changed in the nature of their contract that has allowed them now to resell that transmission. I think I can't remember now the language, Anthony, if we scroll up a little bit, but if the entity could not, if something changed in the terms of the contract prior to the start date of the reservation, they would not be able to resell that transmission. What happens is then that reverts back to ATC to be made available for others to purchase. So this resale provisions really kick in after the start of the request has taken place, and something has changed in the nature of the contract. The resource is down for a prolonged period of time, so entities can act on that contract, or something else that has now allowed for that entity no longer needs that priority because there's been a change in the contractual nature, and now they can resell that priority for the remaining term of the reservation of the request that they received ATC for. So we saw it as fairly narrow, the circumstances under which entities can first be subject to a resale, because we don't want entities to just get this capacity and potentially by demonstrating one contract and then reselling it to others under different terms. So we said if something's changed to your contract prior to the start date, you can't resell that. That has to go back to be available ATC. So this only applies if after the start date there's been a substantial change to the contract such that entities can't perform under those, and the entity is stuck with the capacity that they're paying for, that high priority. And in that instance, you can resell it, and we'll be monitoring that entities have not been entering into these types of arrangements frivolously and just to get the capacity, and only just to get the priority and be able to resell it later. That's the monitoring part that we would require them to demonstrate that something has changed to the contract that allows them to resell it, and then we could do some random checks as well over time as to what the conditions were that allowed them now to resell that capacity, or to resell that ATC, that priority. I don't know if that makes sense. Anthony, I don't know if you want to add anything to that, but that was.
Yeah, I mean, I would say, Milos, if you're looking at somebody who's making making resales and they haven't, their supply contract hasn't terminated, they haven't lost their unit or lost the unit or lost their supply or haven't struck a much better deal somewhere else, and they're out making a lot of resales, I think that's going to be a flag that something's up. So I think there are factors that we can look at. Again, the OAT does not require, have this contract requirement. So I think we were, a little reluctant to put it in, but we, it is something we're going to monitor. I think both the ISO board and the EIM governing body, both brought this up, the importance of monitoring, and I think we are going to, actively be looking, and I think there's enough red flags where somebody might get referred for making sales. So I think there's again, we're going to have to get experience with this and see what happens. But at this point, we think there's enough things that we can look for to see whether somebody is maybe possibly end running the process.
Does it say, I'm trying to skim here quickly and see, does it say that you can only resell if your contract changes? I mean,
I don't think it says that. I don't think it says that.
so the kind of the fail-safe that you're thinking of in relying kind of assumes that somebody would only resell it if the contract that they use to support the priority somehow changed or a resource was out of service or whatever. But I mean, it seems to me there's nothing to prevent somebody from reselling it if they can just make more money reselling it than the resource, than delivering the resource that originally supported the contract. And I to the point about, what the OAT requires, you've pointed out any number of times that this is not, that a wheeling priority is not a transmission reservation. It's not a purchase of guaranteed transmission service. It's different. So I don't see any impact. I mean,
Yeah.
if you can impose a requirement to that a priority be supported by a contract in order to get the priority in the first place, I don't see why you can't require the assignee to show that it has a contract. And then that, I think, would at least avoid the sort of potential gaming and profiteering.
Yeah, and maybe Bonnie, along those lines, maybe note that in your comments. Let us think about that a bit more, because let us think how we can close some of these gaps or the gaming doors to this a bit more directly here, and then supplement that with monitoring. Because up above, we did set the expectation in one of the earlier sections that we did talk about, is that if something's changed in your contract prior to that service, or I can't remember if actually we made a distinction between prior or not, but that entities have to notify us and tell us that, and the capacity would go back to be made available to others. ATC would be made available to others to procure or to request. So let us look at that connection a little bit more, and how we can further close the doors to what we're intending here, is preventing this resell being a way to game and potentially have one contract just to get the ATC and establish the priority, and then later potentially not really have an intent to use it, but to intend to resell it to others. So let us look at those two sections a bit together more.
Great, thank you.
Greg?
Oh, hello, can you hear me?
Yes, your line is unmuted, go ahead.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, so just following up on Bonnie's questions, that just a clarifying question: can the assignee, the entity that's that's buying the reservation, can it then resell to other parties also? I guess I was assuming that it could do that.
I don't think we thought about that particular, but I think it probably would be able to, but again, I think that's not something we sat down and actually talked about.
Okay, because assuming that it can, then it seems like kind of the rules that are like, it's then becoming the same sort of entity that had the reservation. So you would think then it should have the same obligations that the initial reservee had. And that with that, it seems like it could also almost just be simpler from like a review process to have them hold that contract, which is, I think, what in part Bonnie was saying, or maybe not, but just trying to kind of echo that point, that it seems simpler just to maintain that requirement, similar to what you would have on anybody making that reservation. Because in terms of like the review, doing it like a kind of random review and spot check to see what participation's like, and assessing and somewhat of the intent and any gaming and kind of what that would look like and the repercussions of that that hasn't been spelled out exactly. So like that whole process seems a little more ambiguous versus just having a simple contract requirement. So just another thought there.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that. Yeah, as we were crafting this, Greg, we were also trying to think through just administratively, how do we are we able to track all this, the more of these daisy chains that become, but also I think under some of the FERC guidance, when it comes to resales, the original party that holds that would have held particular rights, they continue in a resale as opposed to an assignment. They continue to remain on the hook for payments to the transmission providers. That's what we're trying to keep the original entity that's making the resale, that reserved the high priority and is now in the process of reselling it to others. Our relationship remains with the original requester that obtained the high priority, and that we would continue to settle with them for the WAC charges, and then it will be between the two parties that are subject to the resale to determine how things flow through between them. But we wouldn't try to get in the middle there and change relationships. So that may get a little tricky, and we may lose something in the middle of that process, depending on who they're reselling that to, and if they're going through a process of creating a scheduling coordinator and meeting all of the requirements of the tariff. I thought it was an easier relationship to maintain, and I think consistent with the original party. But we can certainly look at it, and depending on the prevalence of those daisy chains, if it's a resale of a resale of a resale, I don't expect that to occur or be prevalent, but that's something we can think through internally, and as well as that's an aspect of monitoring that we can do if we need to establish a different relationship with somebody, with a reseller or a resellee, depending on how frequently we're seeing these things occur and how far they go down. But that's a fair point. Thanks for raising it, Greg. We'll note it and we'll think about it, and feel free to include it as well in your comments on this section.
Thanks.
Do you have any other questions?
Yes, no additional questions in queue.
Okay, let's move on to 26145. I think I'll take a couple of these miscellaneous ones and then stop for questions before we go to Appendix L. All right, so, and this really gets into compensation. Scheduling coordinators for customers with a monthly or daily wheeling through priority will pay the applicable WAC charges based on the megawatt amount and total hours of the priority for the applicable period. Again, we give an example here. So for example, a priority wheeling through customer with a monthly priority based on a 6x16 day power supply contract would pay WAC charges using a 6x16 hour contract for the entire month, regardless of the scheduling coordinator's actual scheduled priority wheeling throughs during that period. A daily wheeling through customer with a daily priority based on an 8-hour power supply contract would pay the WAC for 8 hours, regardless of its actual use of scheduled wheels during that day. One thing we talked about in the stakeholder process, any payments made for these monthly priorities will be credited towards satisfaction of any prepayment amounts required to obtain CRRs through the out-of-balancing authority area load serving entity CRR allocation process, which is in Section 36. The customer will have to pursue that option separately but these dollars would be credited toward any prepayment obligation. To the extent a priority wheeling through customer schedules any kind of wheeling through transactions in excess of the priority through wheeling through quantity or outside of the hours of the priority, such volumes are not covered by the priority and would be separately charged at the applicable wheeling access rate. Again, let me cover a couple of sections here and then I'll stop. Another key item is the post-haste process in 34.12.3. We propose to retain that. However, it's going to require a few changes. I will admit the discussion of this is rather convoluted, but basically, you know, it's going to continue to use the lower of concept. So for ISO demand, it's going to basically be the lower of, you know, bids from specified resources, or basically the sum of, you know, of shown RA and non-RA that has supported by ATC. It would include any resources supported by capacity awarded ATC in the daily request window. It would include any CPM import capacity awarded ATC or supported by TRM plus the remaining TRM quantity. For PT wheels, again, it's going to be the similar concept that we have in the existing approach, the lower of, you know, scheduled PT wheels versus the, you know, total amount of PT wheels that have been awarded capacity. I know, some concerns were, you know, expressed about how this works during the course of the stakeholder process. So the ISO has basically, you know, added some language here, and I am gonna read that to walk through what we've added here to this section. So basically, we've added language that ISO operators will review the application of pro rata curtailments of priority wheeling through transactions, and in their discretion may approve or disapprove such curtailments after considering the reliability impacts of the curtailments. And consistent with good utility practice, the ISO must use reasonable efforts not to curtail priority wheeling through transactions without also having to shed ISO load proportionately. ISO operators will consider overall system conditions and the reasons for the potential need for curtailment, including actual load is at risk of curtailment, excluding load conformance prior to issuing curtailment. And another point that I think we made clear during the process and want to include this in the tariff, in no event will the ISO reduce priority wheeling through transactions solely in the event of an ISO shortfall that triggers a power balance in feasibility. And before I take questions, I will also note that we would propose to change the definition of priority wheeling through, and that's basically a wheeling through that gets a priority under Section 23, and the interim language no longer applies. So before we move on to the Appendix L tariff changes, let's discuss the couple of sections we just talked about. So let's take any questions.
While we wait for...
Yeah, I haven't seen any questions.
No questions. No questions on the phone only line either.
Someone just raised their hand. There are no questions on the phone only line, but I do see that Tyler has raised his hand.
Okay, go ahead.
Hey, Anthony. I was just wondering if you could help me on the demand for the CAISO, how that pro rata share is calculated. I was trying to walk through the different components and see kind of what's the difference in the two that you're comparing to take the lower of. And I guess I didn't, in practice, kind of come to the conclusion of what we're trying to reflect in those two differences. I was wondering maybe Milos or Anthony if you could say it in kind of without all the detailed components of what we're trying to account when we're.
I mean, at the end of the day, for the ISO load, it's basically going to be, you know, what's supported by ATC, what's supported by, you know, it's going to be, again, so there's two things. It's going to be the lower of, and one of them is basically, you know, what's the ATC number, what's the TRM number. In a nutshell, it's, you know, the ATC and TRM set aside for native load, but it's not just that, it's the lower of what has been bid in under each of those categories. And it's the same thing for the PT wheel. We look at the awarded PT wheels, and we're going to take the lower of the awarded PT wheels or what the PT wheels have scheduled in. So it's a similar concept there.
And if I can add, Tyler, at least just focusing on the ISO portion, on the demand portion. Yeah, they're just trying to capture just all of those. You know, it's the native load set aside. It's what's the imports that are supported by, if we're in certain conditions, and we likely are. If we're gone so far as to trigger the post-HAS process, it's likely that we have also brought in additional imports that are being met by the uncertainty for which the TRM has been set aside. And so it's really just trying to convey that it's all of those imports that are serving load, that are supported by what we already set aside, both in the monthly horizon and are carrying through, or if there's been any incremental imports that have been contracted that may have gotten access to ATC in the daily horizon if they were able to, and then any imports that may have been supported by the TRM that's already been set aside for different types of uncertainty that we'll talk about a bit about later. And so it's also trying to convey the concept that if you've gotten into the situation now, you're realistically, you're looking at what's been scheduled. You're looking at the lower of, as Anthony noted, or what's been reserved or scheduled, but likely here you're looking at, you know, the different schedules of these transactions that are actually on the system at this interface at this particular hour where you have to trigger this post-HAS process. So you're looking at, while you may have awarded, you know, a number of transactions, the request for ATC or the higher priority or set aside for native load, you're ultimately going to look at what's been scheduled from these when you're making that post-HAS allocation between the two. So you're looking at the lower of, as Anthony mentioned, between awarded and scheduled for both the native load component or the demand ISO demand component that consists of all of those different elements that we've mentioned, the RA imports, the non-RA contracted stuff that you've protected, additional import that may be supported by the TRM, or if they got access to daily ATC, and then the high priority wheels that have been awarded, that have secured the high scheduling priority in the monthly horizon and or the daily horizon. And you're looking at really here what's been scheduled that you're looking to protect. I don't know if I butchered that even more, but you can correct me or add.
I think I got it, Milos and Anthony. Thank you for explaining it. It's basically what did you think you would need for native load and wheel throughs versus what shows up in that hour for native load and wheel throughs. Yeah, based on what you protected, and those horizons. And so,
Milos, I want to add another thing here that actually, as I read the tariff language a little closer, it looks like something we had that I thought was in here may have got accidentally removed. We are also, and this comes from our final proposal, we will include a statement that, you know, the amount of capacity considered for pro rata allocation in the post-HAS process cannot exceed the TTC of the interface. And that was a key provision that was added in our final proposal, and we would add that it was in the tariff language at some point. I think as we probably tried to finalize this, it somehow got taken out, but we would include a provision to that extent as well.
Are there any other questions?
There are no additional questions at this time.
Okay, let's move on to Appendix L, and this is, the ISO's existing ATC methodology for which we will be, making, edits to basically conform to what's in the draft final proposal about how we're going to be calculating ATC. I'm probably going to focus on some of the, the higher level points here, and then we'll stop after a few sections, but probably not going to focus on some of the more cleaned up type edits. I think one thing that's key is, what's considered an existing transmission commitment for purposes of calculating ATC. So in L13, we would be making some revisions there to make it clear that the ET commitment, it includes transmission capacity for existing contracts, TORs, transmission capacity for priority wheeling throughs, and plus all native load needs determined in accordance with Appendix L, including native load growth in the applicable horizon. I think when we get to, let's go down to L133. So here's where we really start talking about, how we're calculating the native load needs that are going to be reflected in the ATC calculation. Again, seeking to follow the methodology that we talked about in our final proposal. So let me, I'm going to read this. I think it's probably easier rather than summarizing some of this. So the ETC commitment will include transmission capacity at the interties that is set aside to meet native load needs. The amount of such transmission capacity, apart from the amount of transmission capacity to serve expected native load growth as described below, at each intertie for each calendar month equals the highest quantity of total RA import supply under contract and non-RA import supply under contract to LSEs dedicated to serving their load as demonstrated by RA showings, the non-RA contract showings under Section 2331 at the intertie for the same calendar month during the previous 2 years as may be adjusted by subsequent sections. So this basically, follows what was in our proposal that we're going to, look at that, take the highest number for the prior 2 years, and that will be the basis for the native load need number. So I'm going to stop there and see if we have any questions.
Right. I do not currently see any questions in queue.
Okay, the next one, let's go to L1331, which is native load growth. Transmission capacity at the intertie that is set aside in the ETC commitment to meet native load needs also includes transmission capacity to serve expected native load growth in the applicable horizon. The amount of such transmission capacity at each intertie set aside in ETC COM to meet native load growth will be calculated by comparing the load forecast for the applicable future period to the forecast used with the set of ISO RA requirements applicable to that period for the previous 2 years to determine an overall native load growth amount, and then assigning a portion of this expected native load growth amount to each intertie using the highest ratio of RA imports shown for that calendar month to total RA capacity shown for that calendar month during the previous 2 years. And again, this, is using the methodology set forth in our final proposal. So I'm gonna stop and see if anybody has any questions regarding that.
Yeah, let's go to Bonnie.
Hi, Bonnie Blair, Six Cities. So why wouldn't the assignment process, that's kind of the last part of that subsection, also reflect imports from non-RA resources during that same 2-year period? In other words, you're gonna assign among interties, it sounds like, based only on historical usage for RA, but why wouldn't you also reflect non-RA?
I think one issue, Bonnie, may be that we don't have a forecast. I mean, it's easy for us. We have the forecast for RA. We know what load forecasts are underlying RA showings, and we can see how that changes from 1 year to the next. I'm not certain that we have anything that's comparable for any non-RA numbers.
Okay, but you're.
Yeah, and I get your point, Bonnie. I'm just thinking through this. Maybe note that.
I'm wondering if we're doing a little bit of apples to oranges. I'm sorry, Milos. I interrupted your.
Yeah, I think you're right. Let us maybe think a little bit about that. Yeah, the idea ultimately is how can we most accurately kind of reflect where we're going to see imports coming to serve this logo. So it may not be, if we have already historical information, which will, on non-RA imports as well, maybe we're looking at kind of what you're suggesting is look at both combined and where you're likely going to see together contracted imports to come from, which may be slightly different than if you're just looking at RA. And I get that point. And maybe note that in your comments. I think that may help with the accuracy, or at least giving us a better sense of where, how to distribute this load growth. So we can certainly look at that.
Because you certainly have.
I think I get your suggestion. Yeah.
Yeah, you have the flow information because that's used in MIC, right?
Yeah, and we'll also have, I think, through this process, also your historical, at least, especially as you start this, we'll have the historical information on non-RA imports. Where have they been that are contracted? Where have they been coming from? And that, maybe you combine both, look at historical RA and non-RA just to create that ratio. Where am I most likely to see this load growth from an import perspective be coming from? And kind of looking at both numbers, where has historical RA and non-RA contracted stuff come from, as opposed to just, I think what you're getting as opposed to just looking at RA, look at the non-RA contracted stuff as well to help inform where do you make that assumption that the load growth is going to be coming from.
Right.
Served. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, let us think about that as well. And please do note it in case we miss it. I'll note it on my notes, but note it in your suggestion as well when you're submitting comments, and we'll talk about that internally and see how best to reflect that.
Okay, thanks, Milos.
Okay, the next one, any more questions on the native load growth?
I do not see any additional questions in queue.
Okay. All right, the next is, adjustments to native load growth needs based on new contract information. Again, as we talked about in our discussion of 2333, we can use new contract information to update or otherwise inform the historical RA import supply or non-RA import supply described in this section, with the overall goal of improving the accuracy of the calculation of native load growth needs calculated 13 months before the applicable calendar month. This sort of is basically is summarizing what we're doing in 23.3.3 that we talked about before. The other issue that we've talked about is that is the monthly update of native load needs. So following the RA and non-RA import contract showings at the end of the RA tier period under Section 40, the ISO will update or true up the amount of transmission capacity set aside in the ETC COM to meet native load needs at each intertie to include the sum of the most recent actual showings of one RA import supply contained in a monthly RA import resource adequacy plan, and two non-RA import supply delivered to the intertie reported to the ISO for the same calendar month. So, again, at the 13-month stage, we're basing things based on historical RA and non-RA, but as we get to the month ahead, after the month ahead RA showings, we are looking at actual RA and non-RA showings. There's a bunch of discussion that follows. I'm going to try and put this down into a few scenarios. So what might happen if the actual RA and non-RA that is shown differs from the amount of historical RA and non-RA that's been used to set the ATC. And I think, I think these three examples are covered by the next couple of paragraphs. Again, as you read through this, we did put three examples in here, again, to sort of illustrate how this might work. Please review those closely to make sure they're, not only accurate, but also, informative and helpful as to how this would work. I think really the first scenario is that actual RA and non-RA showings come in at the end of the cure period, and those showings are less than the amount of ATC we set aside for ISO load based on historical RA and expected load growth. If that's the case, that basically creates more ATC that is available for wheels to obtain a wheeling through priority or maybe through the daily request window process. The second, a second scenario is that in the month ahead timeline, the RA and non-RA showings that come in exceed the amount of ATC that's been set aside for native load and native load growth based on historical numbers. And if that situation exists and there is ATC available that has not been awarded to, to wheeling through priorities in prior months, that, the additional RA and non-RA quantities can be used to fill up that unused ATC after we have accounted for TRM for load uncertainty. So there's I think it's the second example under L1333 shows how that works. That we're not first going to go straight to the ATC and take it off. We're going to see how much we set aside in the TRM for load uncertainty. We will take the excess off of that first, and if there is more remaining and there's unused ATC, we will then apply that unused ATC to account for the incremental RA and non-RA showings above the native load set aside. Again, I encourage you to read the example that walks through that. The third example is, the third scenario is basically the RA and non-RA showings in the month-ahead timeline exceed the native load and native load set aside. However, there is no ATC left over from the prior months. It's all gone, been awarded to priority wheels. Under that situation, all the ATC has been awarded. There's no additional ATC available to give for the additional RA and non-RA showings for native load. Again, the examples written up in L1333 try and walk through that. So again, I encourage everybody to read them. I think that's a mouthful, so let's stop and take questions from folks on this.
Yeah, let's go to Doug.
Hi, Doug Boccignone for BAMX. That third example or scenario where sort of there's no ATC remaining, I'm trying to think through what could cause that. And it seems like the only way that happens is if the TTC gets reduced more than the TRM could accommodate. And then, you know, because of that, there's not enough ATC, there's no ATC remaining. But I'm wondering if it would make more sense to sort of generalize this a little bit, because it seems like a more likely scenario is there's just not as much available as you expected originally. So, you know, there's this statement in the second paragraph towards the, what is it, the second to last sentence or third to last sentence about going back to the original RA and non-RA showings amounts, or the amount originally calculated. And it seems like it's more likely to be somewhere in between. You know, so it would be limited to the, you know, what's available, you know, but per your calculation.
Yeah, and Doug, so just maybe help Anthony and me, and maybe Anthony, what you're suggesting is, are you suggesting that we generalize a bit and create kind of a new, a kind of more general, different example? Is that what you're suggesting?
Yeah, well, it just seems like that particular scenario seems pretty unlikely. It seems a lot more likely that, you know, you may not be able to accommodate all of these increased RA and non-RA showings. But I mean, I think the point you're trying to make is you're still going to honor the previous wheel through.
That's right.
That you were able to accommodate, and it seems like you could do that and still accommodate increased native load needs up to the TRM, or the lesser of the original TRM, and how it's been reduced because of a TTC, you know, or an OTC reduction that impacts the TTC. So
okay, I think I got it. Let me yeah, maybe Anthony, yeah, note that if you wouldn't mind, put that as well in your comments. I'll note it in my notes, and we can talk internally and see, you know, can we, maybe we'll leave these, but we also add that additional scenario that you're talking about. But yeah, let us think through that a bit, and if you want to, you know, if as part of your comments you want to you have a particular way that you're thinking about how best to illustrate that, include that in there as well, and we'll talk about it internally. But I'll write it down, and we'll talk here before even comments come on, how we can capture that a kind of more realistic scenario, as you note, or a variation to these scenarios.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
Stephen?
Hi, Steve Keen from Edison. I'm a little confused about how this would work. If we get to, and this is like with example 3, where there's no ATC remaining, you say that you won't reduce the priority wheel through amounts, which means I assume that somebody coming in with MIC at that point won't actually be able to flow. Will that still count for RA?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yes, and so, and I want to make this tees me up well, I think, for what I'm. It's a great question. So, yes, you would still. What this means is just that, going into the month, because in the daily time frame, depending on what the conditions are, potentially some of the TRM for other uncertainty may be utilized to support, to account for additional imports. But what this means is that going into the month, all of those shown RA plus non-RA imports going into the month may not necessarily be fully protected in that post-HAS process if we get into that kind of a condition where that process triggers. So you can continue to show these in the month, in that monthly horizon. They will count for RA. You would show them your RA plan. What this means is once you get into that, and you can continue to offer them into the market at that interface economically, self-schedule, however you want, just as you do today. The market is going to optimize these based on the conditions that it's seeing and the needs on the system. What this really means is if you get into that singular condition where that post-HAS process is ultimately triggered, which again is in very rare and limited circumstances, you have to have multiple conditions happening at the same time. But if you do get into that post-HAS process, some of those imports may not necessarily be protected within that post-HAS process at that highest priority that's equal to that equal priority between those import serving load versus high priority wheeling through transactions. That's what really that means, but it does not preclude from a showing in the monthly RA timeframe, does not preclude from scheduling them. The market is going to continue to optimize it much as it does today. It's just in those very narrow circumstances that some subset of those that imports, since we didn't have enough capacity set aside for them in those monthly horizons, may potentially not necessarily be protected at that equal priority to high priority wheels. Now, having said that, more realistically, what would happen is that if you are in that third scenario, where let's just say 20 megawatts, for lack of a better number, just to make it easy, 20 megawatts of these RA and non-RA contracted showings, we just didn't have enough ATC to protect them, or TRM, just excess of everything. There's not enough. So we don't want to exceed the total transfer capability of that path. And so those 20 megawatts, if we get into that post-HAS process, there may be 20 megawatts of those that are not protected. But once you get into really the daily and those conditions where you are at risk of triggering that post-HAS process, there may be, there is TRM, and we'll get to TRM, I think, next or right below, but we may still have some TRM set aside for different types of uncertainties, and some of those imports, if scheduled, would likely get protected, or some of that TRM that may still exist at the interties would be utilized to support additional imports that could have that protection. Because again, if you're in that post-HAS process that it triggers, you're likely now in a condition where you are relying on additional imports because different types of uncertainty materialize on the system. And so even though you may not potentially be able to protect those imports in that monthly time frame, once you get into that daily horizon, to the extent that there's still additional TRM available at any of those interties, those additional imports would effectively, if there's again that TRM, would be considered under that TRM rubric, because the condition very likely materialized if you're now going to be in that post-HAS process where you have to afford equal priority to import serving load and high priority wheels. So I don't know if that made sense, but practically what I'm trying to illustrate is that in that third case scenario, while you may not be able to, there may be some over number of that you cannot protect of imports in that monthly scenario, you can still again show them and schedule them into the market. If we are in a situation that's dire, that forces you to trigger that post-HAS process, it's very likely that some, if not all of those imports would be protected because you have other TRM that you've set aside precisely for that uncertainty. Unless the uncertainty is so large and extreme that you now, have that even utilization of your entire TRM is not sufficient. But in that daily horizon, you're likely utilizing some of the TRM to support those additional imports that, if they're scheduled, that may not have, necessarily been protected in that monthly set aside process, because the showings have exceeded everything you've planned for them. They exceeded the TRM for that particular uncertainty, and there was no additional ATC in that monthly horizon. But once you get into the operational time frame, if there's still some TRM remaining at that interface, and you're in the conditions that trigger the post-HAS process, you're likely utilizing that TRM to already support those additional imports that you may not have, those RA or non-RA contracted imports that you may not have been able to protect in the monthly horizon.
I think I understand your answer.
Sense. Yeah.
But I have two comments on that and then one question. The comments are, that concerns me because of the PUC's rules on import RA. If it doesn't flow, it doesn't count, and they can go back ex post and determine that somebody, that an LSE was deficient. So I'm trying to think through the implications of that. If we put a contract, if we put something in RA using MIC that we were awarded in this month ahead, and it doesn't flow, then we may be dinged as being deficient because it didn't flow. And I'm not
flow for an hour, or
I don't know. I mean, I don't remember what the rules are that the PUC uses on that, but I know they do look at how it was bid. I can't remember if they're looking at how it was bid or if it was, whether it actually flows, because I don't remember exactly the rules, but that's something that I think we need to look at. The other thing is, it seems to me, when you talk about this as being, not being terribly likely, but I think during, probably during the summer months and during the, peak days and peak periods, I don't see it as, if the ATC that's been awarded either for MIC and for the ATC exceeds the transfer capacity on a line, I think it's probably going to actually flow, and it's going to be an issue. I don't deal enough with the actual transmission stuff to know how likely that is. That would be something that would be really interesting to know, like how filled up these lines are. And obviously there's certain lines that we're talking about that are, filled up all the time, and other ones that are probably not. So that's kind of the second comment. And then the question is, has the ISO thought about what this might mean for RA, the implications for RA? Because basically the implication is you're counting something as an RA resource that may not actually be able to deliver when you really need it.
Yeah. So let me tackle all three of them, walk through them one by one. But I think on the first point, I don't know that the requirement is that you have to flow. I think the requirement is that you have to bid those resources in, and this does not preclude you in any way from continuing to show these resources on the RA plans. We have, on certain number of occasions, you get all kinds of different bids on different interties under conditions, and so this does not preclude you in terms of showing continuing to show the RA on the monthly showing, and does not preclude you from bidding, because the market is going to ultimately be awarding, and they may not even award these depending on what the conditions are, but the market is going to be looking economically at awarding these schedules across the internal resources, interfaces, and it's not going to be precluding you from self-scheduling this subset of non-RA or non-source specific imports. So I think the requirement is that you bid them in, not necessarily that there's a guarantee that they're going to flow, because there's different conditions on the grid that may not make those awardable if there's a transmission constraint or something else. But and then on the last point in terms of impacts on RA, like we noted here, the intent is that you continue to be able to show those monthly RA showings. We're going to do everything that we can to account for them. That's why I think it places an additional emphasis on that. We talked about that one section a little bit earlier on the stakeholder process ahead of the summers, particularly the summer where you're about to calculate the ATC numbers for that. And through that stakeholder process, we're looking really at what are those historical showing numbers in order to try to estimate as good as we can what are those native load needs going to be based on RA and non-RA contracted imports on a forward basis, but also account for the risk or uncertainty that what are the factors and the things that are going on the grid or the system that are influencing procurement one way or another for imports, and accounting for some of that risk as an uncertainty risk within the TRM. And we'll do that through that stakeholder process. What are the different things that are going on changes in the RA structure, RA program, contracting, procurement? We'll have those discussions through that stakeholder process in order to account for some of that risk as TRM, and so that you minimize the incidence of when the actual showings come in that you are short because you didn't have enough TRM or you didn't have enough ATC because it was all bought up. But there is that risk, and we're going to try to manage it and mitigate it through that stakeholder discussion and considering what's the likelihood that and what are the factors that may be driving for different procurement than what we've seen historically from an RA import side, and trying to account for that.
Yeah, thank you. I think that to me emphasizes that when you do that summer thing, you need to be looking a year ahead then.
Yeah, and that was the original intent was in the design, is that because you're going to do it in a bit ahead of the summer, that you're not because you already are going to have those ATC numbers and the set asides for the nearest summer. That if we're doing this in April and May, you're already going to have the ATC numbers for June through July of the fall of that next summer that just starts a couple of months out. But really the focus was on as you're about to calculate the ATC for now that 13-month out summer and estimate those needs, having a transparent process where we're laying out, okay, based on the methodology, these are the numbers we're seeing, and these are the factors, and then having a discussion, are there factors or considerations here that may drive differences from historicals, and what are those? Are there changes in the RA program that may drive that? Are there increases in PRM, for example, that may drive some additional imports? And let's talk through those and determine what is that risk of deviation from those historical values, and look to account for that risk in as much as possible through subset of the TRM, and have those open discussions with stakeholders. And it's not completely going to eliminate that risk that the actual showings may ultimately come way above what you have anticipated or estimated. But it's going to look to mitigate that and try to anticipate it as much as reasonably possible. And if it does happen, that now those showings are well above what you've estimated, plus the TRM that you may have accounted for this uncertainty, there is that risk, but we would not be impacting or taking capacity away from those high priority wheel throughs that may have already accessed that ATC. And as I said, I think there may be there are other ways where some of that risk gets mitigated in the real-time horizon, because you may have TRM set aside for other types of uncertainty that, those imports that may not have been protected in a monthly time frame, if they're scheduled in those daily and the hourly horizons, if the system is at risk such that you're potentially going to trigger this post-hatch process, you're very likely relying on those imports and using those imports because some of the uncertainty has materialized, and you can protect them in that way through other TRM components. But but yeah, that's why those, I think summer discussions are going to be important to vet the assumptions that we've used, the scenarios, and then have a discussion. Are we missing something? Is there an uncertainty here that's going to drive these imports to be higher than maybe historically we've looked at? And if so, let's talk through the reasonableness of those risks and if we need to account for them through an uncertainty margin.
All right, thank you.
Thanks for raising that point. Really appreciate it.
Okay. Are there any other questions on this area?
I do not see any additional questions.
Okay, I will move on to L15, which is the TRM, and go over some of the changes there. I think key are, adding some of the additional points factors that we'll be considering in our TRM that we do not today. That includes aggregate load forecast uncertainty and variations in generation dispatch, including but not limited to forced or unplanned outages, maintenance outages, and future resource additions. We got, various clarifications in here consistent with our proposal. One thing that we've done is added a little more description to the two additional factors that we've added, and let me just read those, which are new tariff language. The ISO uses the aggregate load forecast component of uncertainty to address load forecast uncertainty at selected interties. The ISO will set this component of uncertainty as a percentage of TTC pursuant to the ISO Available Transmission Capability Implementation Document, which is something we'll be preparing before this goes into effect, across the rolling 13-month time horizon and the rolling 7-day horizon on interties where the ISO has historically relied on import supply to serve load. The load forecast component of TRM may include subcomponents to account for 1, the uncertainty that actual monthly RA and non-RA showings may differ from historical values used in setting the ECOM. 2, changes ordered by local regulatory authorities and planning reserve margins or resource procurement requirements for LSEs and load forecast changes. Regarding the other factor that we've added on uncertainty in generation, the ISO uses the variations in generation dispatch component of uncertainty to address variations in generation dispatch driven by resource outages or other conditions to recognize that in some circumstances, supply may have to be replaced or additional supply may have to be brought into the system to meet the changing needs. For example, the TRM may account for the unavailability of solar energy during a net peak load period, the unavailability of hydroelectric capacity during drought conditions, or wind capacity not performing at NQC. The ISO will set this component of uncertainty as a percentage of TTC pursuant to the ATC Capability Implementation Document. Actually, I think that probably should say TRM Implementation Document. I don't know. That's something we need to talk about. Across the rolling 13-month time horizon and the 7-day rolling horizon on interties where the ISO has historically relied on import supply to serve load. So I will stop and take any questions on the TRM portion.
Currently, no questions in queue.
Okay, moving on. I think any other, moving on, the ISO does not have a CBM. That's an existing provision of the tariff that we are not proposing to change. In the back, in sections L3, we basically just put in some clarification edits talking about the 13-month horizon and the 7-day horizon to calculate ATC and TTC. At the very end, I think we add a provision, to recognize that, we'll be updating the TTC determination, across the 7-day horizon to reflect, current information on anticipated transfer capability of the network, including information on outages and intertie transfer capability. So those are all that's everything that I was prepared to walk through, but I will, open it up for, any questions on the last sections or any other questions about any of the other sections that folks might have.
Let's go to Greg.
Jumping back quickly to the TRM section, so L.1.5, which is the lower portion of it. One just quick clarification where in the bottom of that first page, in the edited section, or the second page, I guess, it references across the rolling 13-month time horizon. And I just want to confirm, will that TRM be adjusting each month as you get closer to the date across that 13-month time frame, or is it set at one point in time?
This is Milos. I'm not sure if you're referring to a specific term here, but the intent was, I think the TRM document, as we get into calculating some of the aspects of the TRM document will describe some of these details a bit more. But the idea is that the TRM calculation is not necessarily static. Depending on the different types of uncertainties that you're looking to protect, you may have a particular component in the monthly horizon that you necessarily don't carry down into the daily horizon, as we've described in the what's it called, in the paper. So the intent is not that these are static and unchangeable, and you may have from one year to the next, depending on what's going on the grid, you may consider a different component or additional component of uncertainty that you may need to protect for, that maybe you didn't protect for in the prior horizon. So the idea is that these are malleable based upon the circumstances that you see on the grid, and as the grid evolves, so does potentially some of the aspects that you're looking to protect on the TRM. If you, for example, have a significant resource, let's just, I'm not going to name names of a resource, but let's just say the critical resource goes down a couple of thousand megawatts and it's a long-term outage for the entire summer or for an entire year, you may consider a specific TRM for the fact that you've lost a large generator, that you may have to make up some portion of that with imports, and you may then consider that as TRM. But the idea is that these are not static and that they may evolve. As you get closer in time, you may release some of the TRM, like the TRM, for example, that we may be setting aside for the uncertainty associated with the showings maybe being different than the historical amounts. You would not necessarily carry that into the daily horizon if you would set that at the monthly horizon, and you would, once the actual showings come in, you would release if that condition didn't materialize. But you may carry some of the other TRM components, and you may adjust them a bit closer in time as you get closer to the daily horizon. But you would always carry some of those other components with you into the daily horizon, but maybe not others. So that's not trying to be as kind of prescriptive within the tariff itself. The TRM document is really meant for adjustments, more nimble adjustments to certain components, and we would, through that document, capture, and through our discussions in those summer meetings, discuss what TRM component, and what's the size of those that may need to account for. We would certainly bring to the table what those TRM amounts are and how we've come up with them. But some of them certainly can change as you get closer in time.
Okay, that's really helpful. Yeah, I think maybe I was getting caught up on the across the rolling 13-month time horizon versus like throughout the rolling 13-month time horizon, something like that.
I see.
Okay, and then I have another thing on a question on the example that's used for accounting for changes in generation dispatch. And it's great that those things are being thought through and highlighted. The one item on the unavailability of hydroelectric capacity during drought conditions. It seems like a really important thing to be accounting for, obviously, and has a big impact on the system. But just thinking about if the reservations are happening, for August, the year beforehand, like that's before the hydrological year starts. So like, I guess just a thought, if you have 2 wet years in a row, you're just looking at some historical data, like how would you actually account for that and adjust for that sort of a thing without having insight as to what the rainfall would be occurring like? I'm just trying to think like how would you actually implement that?
Yeah, that's a fair point. Let us think through that a bit more internally, but I think the idea is, that is a factor that you would want to take into account when accounting for this TRM. So it could be that if we haven't yet started necessarily this process, but as we're looking at these conditions, we are looking at some of those factors on hydro availability and other resource type availability, outages of different facilities potentially across different time horizons that we may be aware of, and taking those factors into account, and that could be one of those factors, hydro availability, for example, that maybe you account for, but as you're getting better information, you are reducing potentially that TRM amount if you're trying to protect for that type of uncertainty. But that's a fair point, and something that I think certainly we'll need to consider internally, and looking at what are all those different factors that may drive some of these TRM developments, keeping in mind that, again, they have to be reasonable and they should not be excessive, but it's certainly numbers that are malleable and that can shift across horizons as you get better information and more accurate data. So we'll take that back, definitely, Greg, and maybe note it in your comments as well. And that will certainly be a factor as we develop the TRMID document and more specifically try to account for different components of TRM and the methodologies associated with them. And as we have those summer discussions prior to releasing the numbers of ATC, I think those are some of the factors we'll want to consider, and what are some of those risks and that we may want to protect for, and then adjust as you have better information closer in time. Thanks for that, Greg.
Okay, yeah, that's helpful. When you say having the summer meeting in advance prior to the release of ATC values, I mean, wouldn't have the ATC values have already been released like months before that meeting?
Yeah,
I just want to make sure I'm understanding the timing here.
Yeah, and so I'm talking mainly about the summer, when you're starting to calculate the ATC for the summer. We haven't yet published those ATC numbers. So, for example,
the following summer, I got you.
Yeah, for the following summer. And so once you've had a couple of these, I think this will be important for the first time that we calculate these numbers. But then I think as we get into these meetings and you're now looking at the further out, summer where you haven't yet calculated those values, those are some factors that you're considering in setting the different components of the TRM and that are impacting your ATC. I think the first time that we calculate them, I think we'll need to more clearly focus on those near-term summer months. But then once you get into this cycle of calculating this every year, and you have that time to calculate that following summer, those are some of the discussions and factors you would take into account, some of the risks and of conditions, low hydro year or outages of some key facilities that you may know by then.
Thanks.
Are there any other questions?
There are no additional questions in queue.
All right, thank you. Hey, again, I really want to thank everybody for your input. Yeah, a lot of really helpful material coming out of this. Again, I encourage everybody to submit written comments, and in particular, if you've got specific tariff edits or suggestions, to include those. That's really super helpful when we start putting this tariff together. So again, thank you, everybody, and I hope everybody has a great weekend.
Thanks, Anthony. Yep, and as a reminder, to reiterate what Anthony said, the deadline is May 10th. So please submit your comments using the template that will be available on the initiative webpage. And if you have any questions, please send an email to me at inicasia@kaiso.com, or you can send it to isostakeholderaffairs@kaiso.com. But that concludes today's meeting. Thank you, everyone, and have a great weekend.
That concludes our conference. Thank you for using Event Services. You may now disconnect.